So these are the people that have come to learn about ancient Greek philosophy at 9 a.m. after the party last night. I'm not sure if that says more about you or me, the fact that I put this talk together. Okay, welcome. This all started because a good friend of mine and ex-business partner was a doctor of psychology at a local university where I live in Melbourne. And him and I have had many great debates over the years about various aspects of human psychology, emotional intelligence. And this ended up with him saying to me, I need to read this book on the left, which is the Daily Stoic. This particular book, the idea behind it is that there's 366 meditations, which are just small little snippets of philosophy that you read every day. I don't know what you do when it's not a leap year. Maybe you kind of just go into the next year, but the idea is you read one every day and it kind of teaches you about it. I must admit, I went into this completely not expecting to enjoy it. I went into this with a very hardened mindset of this is not for me. I'm a software engineer. I live in the world of computers and hardware and binary, and if something doesn't fit into that world, it must be wrong. After reading that first book, I said to him, which book do you recommend next? And after reading that next book, he said to me, I think you're ready for the master of all Stoicism books, which is Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. I was hooked by this, and I had no idea I was going to be hooked. But I wasn't hooked because of the ideas of the world many thousands of years ago. I was hooked by the ideas of how this connected with the work that I was doing on a daily basis. The connections between what people like Marcus Aurelius, like Zeno, who we're going to talk about, the way they thought about the world many, many, many thousands of years ago is very similar to today. And those connections are interesting because those connections tell you something fundamental. If something was true 3,000 years ago, it's probably true today. There has to be something fundamental about the human psyche that means those two things are true. And we're going to go through some of those today. We're going to talk about what is Stoicism through the lens of one of the creators of it, who is Zeno of Citium. A little aside, has anybody heard the name Zeno before? Yeah, have you heard it through Stoicism or something else? Through Stoicism. Anybody heard it not through Stoicism? Has anybody heard of something called Zenos Paradox? Yeah. So Zenos Paradox, it's something in maths. I have this whole intro slide about how amusing it is. So basically, Zenos Paradox is the idea that you can never reach your goal, because in half the time you progress half the distance, and then in half the time you progress the next half the distance. And so you're always asymptotically approaching your goal and never actually reaching it. And I had this really amusing slide about project management and estimation and how that was related to Zenos Paradox. And then somebody pointed out that's a different Zeno. Same name, completely different people. Zeno of Citium versus Zeno of Atreia. So we're going to talk about who Zeno of Citium is, and then Stoicism as a basic concept, and then how Stoicism applies to tech leadership, which is my passion, is technology leadership. This is not a monologue. I'm going to ask for some engagement. I know, again, it's 9 a.m. after a party the night before. I'm going to ask for some engagement. Keep your answers short, purely because I'm going to have to repeat them for the wonderful people watching on the stream and on the YouTube video later. But please engage if I ask a question. You're probably also wondering who the strange person stood in front of you is. I'm Andrew Murphy. I am a long-term father of a flock of chickens, or as we call them in Australia, chucks. 'Cause. I'm the short-term father of a flock of humans, or as we call them in Australia, chooks. I'm the short-term father of a flock of humans, or as we call them in Australia, chooks. 'Cause. I'm the short-term father of a flock of humans, or as we call them in Australia, chooks. 'Cause. I'm the short-term father of a flock of humans, or as we call them in Australia, financial burdens. And I love traveling, getting around, seeing the world. I actually grew up in England. I now live in Australia, but I grew up in England and love traveling, seeing the world with my wife. One of the things, my biggest regret in moving to Australia is that I didn't take my Pride and Joy Land Rover with me to Australia. There's a lot of bio-regulations in Australia where if you import something, you have to clean it, and there can't be any rust anywhere on the vehicle. If you've ever owned a Land Rover, you know that rust is structural and is not coming off. So I was not able to bring my Land Rover to Australia, unfortunately. From a professional point of view, I started in this industry about 20 years ago, probably getting close to 21 years now. My first ever job out of university was a cold fusion developer. Anybody done cold fusion? Yeah. Terrible programming language. If you feel like scaring yourself, look it up. XML as an imperative programming language. Open angular bracket, if, space, expression equals, quote, yada, yada, yada. Awful. Do not do that. But I didn't let that hold me back. So after being a cold fusion developer for a couple of years, I became a VB6 developer. Also a terrible programming language, but much better than cold fusion. Didn't let that hold me back, and I became a PHP developer. Also a terrible programming language, but not as bad as VB6. And eventually got into .NET around 2001, 2002. I got the very first beta of Visual Studio .NET, as it was called back then, and it was shipped in CDs. There were 6 CDs you had to physically install on your computer to get access to .NET, and I was hooked from the beginning. So I love technology, I love coding, but I also got into leadership really early. And I made a bunch of mistakes over the past 15 years that I now teach people about those mistakes. So I spend my time now doing this kind of stuff, going around conferences and companies and talking about technology leadership and how we can be better at what we do. Okay, so let's talk about Zeno. So Zeno was born on an island called Cyprus in the Mediterranean. Amazing place. I've been there many, many, many times. Learned to do my advanced underwater scuba diving there, and he was born in the sort of 4th century BCE, so around the time when Greek and Roman civilization was really, really kicking off. His father was a merchant. Cyprus, if you think about where it is, if you don't know, it's kind of at the crux of the Mediterranean. So it's surrounded by, obviously, Europe, but it's also next to Asia, it's also next to Africa, and so it's this real mixing pot of cultures. And a lot of the ways that Zeno sees the world, we can see probably come from the fact that from a very young age he was exposed to a lot of different cultures. If you grew up, say, in Athens, you probably wouldn't have the same amount of exposures to different cultures as if you grew up in Cyprus at this kind of nexus of different civilizations. Zeno himself, I think it's fair to say, he's one of the most pivotal people in terms of Western philosophy. A lot of what he said around psychology and leadership and self-help really resonate and come through all the later philosophers. And himself also was a merchant. And he dealt in a very, very important substance called Tyrian purple. Not this Tyrian, this Tyrian. Tyrian purple was a dye. It was a purple dye, obviously. And really rich people would use this dye because it was very expensive. So to produce a single pot of this dye used many, many thousands of snails. And they all had to be crushed up by hand. So to have something like that shawl he's wearing would have cost the average worker 2 or 3 years of their salary. And so Zeno was very wealthy. Very, very wealthy. Unfortunately, that was all to come crashing down around him. On a trip from Cyprus to Athens, his entire cargo of Tyrian purple was just smashed in a shipwreck. He lost everything. He lost his entire fortune in one particular shipwreck. Zeno ends up penniless in Greece. He has nothing to his name. He's wandering around the streets of Athens, exploring the city, working out what he's going to do next now that he's lost his fortune. And he goes into a bookstore, and there's somebody there talking about Socrates, talking about the teachings of Socrates, and Zeno gets enthralled by the way this person is speaking. Obviously for the content, but also the way in which this person is speaking, the way that they're expressing themselves, and the kind of the way that the audience is enthralled by the topic. And these two things come to resonate, and Zeno himself dedicates his life to become a teacher and learner of philosophy. He later jokes that although he lost his riches, he gained a fortune in that shipwreck because he changed the way that he viewed the world. Two of the things, before we get into Stoicism, two of the things that he was kind of fundamental in, not necessarily inventing, but shaping the ideas of, these two things here. Does anybody recognize the left thing there and what it is? It's a cocktail, but does anybody know what cocktail it is? I'm asking the wrong room, aren't I? That is a cosmopolitan. So Zeno was one of the founders of the idea of cosmopolitanism. So remember back to where he grew up and where he came from, Cyprus, this city of many, many different cultures, this nexus of the Mediterranean. Cosmopolitanism is the idea that we are either 1 or 8 billion. We are either an individual human being or we are a member of the human race and nothing in the middle. We are not part of a tribe, a race, a city, a country, a culture. We are part of the world. And that we should have the rights as human beings to travel the world, see the world, be part of any other place and just live and work and be wherever we want to. As somebody who travels the world as a job and also for pleasure, I love this concept. I had a goal pre-COVID. I had a goal to visit 2 new countries every year. And from being 21 to COVID, I met that goal every year. When I do that talk in Australia, everybody's like, oh my... I had this goal, and last year I visited 4 new countries. This year I'm on track for 2, so I'm catching up again. So I love this idea of cosmopolitanism. It's very important to me personally, but I think it's also important to the human race, this idea of breaking down barriers. Anybody speak Greek and know what that second word says? Yes? Logos, yeah. Yeah. Yes, a good point. Everybody in this room, if you're a .NET developer, should at least recognize the first, the first letter as a lambda. So yeah, this is logos, which is logic. Somebody had to invent logic. How weird is that as a concept? The idea of if A, then B, and if A and B, therefore not C, and all of this stuff that we kind of take as granted as computer experts, somebody had to invent that. Weird. And Zeno, along with his compatriots, was part of this idea of putting together the kind of formal structure of what logic could look like and how you could have predicates and follows on from predicates. Of course, the thing we're here to talk about, which is Stoicism. So just by a quick show of hands, who's heard of Stoicism before as a concept? Yeah, pretty much everybody. Who feels like, I'm not going to ask anybody to do this, but who feels like they could give, say, a 20, 30-second explanation of Stoicism? Much fewer, like maybe 3, 4 people. And that's where I was before I read these books. I knew of it as a concept, And this idea of Stoicism that I think is part of the, I guess, the zeitgeist, the bias that we have when we hear the word Stoicism tends to be that person never lets anything bother them. They have a straight face. They're very emotionally regulated. That's the kind of bias we have for Stoicism, but that's not really what Stoicism is. Fundamentally, it's this one image. There's this idea that Stoicism, you focus on what you can control. So we'll go into this in more detail, but fundamentally, Stoicism separates the world into two buckets. The bucket of things we can control and the bucket of things we cannot control. It's called the dichotomy of control. And through those things, we should take responsibility for the judgments we make. And I'll talk about what a judgment is and why that word is chosen specifically. And that in doing those things and the actions that we take, we live with arete, which basically means constant improvement, the best oneself can be. And if you do all of these three things, if you focus on what you can control, you live with arete, and you take responsibility for your judgments, you approach this state of eudaimonia. Eudaimonia, literally translated, means happy inner demon. The word demon kind of has a different sense nowadays than it did a couple of thousand years ago. If I was to translate this now into kind of modern English, I would probably say happy inner spirit as opposed to demon. This idea that the human core is happy. So these three concepts are what we're going to discuss, and we're going to talk about how they apply to technology and how they apply to leadership specifically. So first of all, we'll go through these in order and ask the question, what does this have to do with tech leadership? I am at Copenhagen Developers Festival, not Copenhagen Stoicism Festival, which should exist. We should start that. Anybody? Anybody? No? Okay. All right. So let's focus on what we can control. So this is what I said, this dichotomy of control. That's the fancy kind of way of saying it. Dichotomy, basically, if you don't know that word, dichotomy just means separating things into two bits. I call them buckets because I grew up in the north of England. So the basic idea is we cannot control external events or other people's actions. But we can control our actions, our reactions, and the attitudes towards what's happening. So this is really fundamental. We cannot control what other people do and the circumstances outside of ourselves. All we can control is what's within the fleshy meat sack of ourselves. And more specifically, the actions, reactions, and attitudes we have towards stimuli. To make that a little bit more concrete, let's say you're a leader and you've joined a new company, you've joined a new team. There's going to be a lot of things about that situation that you are not in control of. So you just joined a new team. You can't control the team dynamics of that team because you've literally just joined it. You weren't responsible for the creation of that team. You weren't responsible for the dynamics before. So getting stressed about what's happening, not necessarily conducive. You also can't control market dynamics. Market dynamics shift and change all the time. Where we were, in the venture capital boom of 2020, 2021 is definitely not where we are today. That's something you can't control. Anybody work for a consultancy? Yeah? Ever had a client that made a dumb decision? Nah, never. No, never. You can't control that. But thinking about what you can control gives you some sense of ownership over what's happening. And one of those things is, although we can't control the team dynamics, we can control how we manage that team going forward. We can control our actions, reactions, and the way that we view that going on. We can't control the market dynamics, but we can constantly develop our team and support them to grow and become better so that when those market dynamics shift, they're better able to respond to it. And we can't control user and client decisions, but we can build an environment that promotes innovation and allows us to respond to these things more dynamically. So by looking at these things in these two buckets of things we cannot control and things we can control, we can see how we can start building a decision-making framework that allows us to be more rational and responsive. Rather than being incredibly emotional about these things, oh my God, the market's just crashed, what do? We can build environments, teams, and systems that support those things changing. Does that make sense? Yeah, cool. So the second one is, no matter what happens to us, we should take responsibility for our judgments. So I said I'd come back to that word, judgment. One of the fundamental concepts of Stoicism is the separation between events, emotions, and judgments. Has anybody studied neuro-linguistic programming? No. There's this concept in NLP called the map is not the territory. And what they're basically meaning by that is the map is the representation, but the territory is the reality. And that's kind of similar to this. The reality is the event, but the way we respond to it, the emotion, it's not driven by the event itself. It's driven by our judgments about the event. So to give you an example, I was coaching somebody who had just moved from a senior engineer position to a principal engineer position. Historically, they'd always been the person that had closed the most tickets on Jira. They'd always been the person that kind of built the most features, built these really complex architectures. She was an absolutely amazing engineer. And because of that, she was promoted to principal engineer. At the end of the sprint, we were all analyzing the kind of the progress and things that had happened and who'd closed the most tickets. And her name was at the bottom of the list. And she was used to her name being at the top of the list. We can have discussions over beers about metrics and engineers. Hold your thoughts on that. This was a long time ago. And so I said to her, what's going on? She's like, I don't know, I just feel really disappointed in myself. It's like, okay. You shouldn't feel disappointed in yourself, because what's actually happening here is a good thing. The fact that you've moved into a principal engineer position and you're supporting, guiding, and improving the team is what you should be doing. Let's look at what progress we made last sprint, and let's look at what progress we made this sprint as a team. Oh, look, the team velocity has increased massively, even though your individual velocity has gone down. So the event, which was she moved from the top of the highest velocity engineers to the bottom as the lowest velocity engineer, the event had two different judgments associated with it. Her judgment was, I'm doing a bad job. My judgment was, you're doing a really good job. And so this separation between event, judgment, and emotion is important. The event we cannot control. The emotion comes from the judgment, which means it's the judgment we should control. How we think about a situation, what's our internal narrative about something. We have the power to reassess and change the way we think about situations. We can change our internal narrative about what's going on if we start asking ourselves questions about it. Really here, what I'm talking about is like stress management, emotional resilience, leading towards a place where you're not necessarily letting everything wash over you and not affect you, because that's not healthy either. But you're using it as a way to reshape and reframe situations so that you can think about them in a positive place as opposed to a negative place. Lastly, we've got this concept of living with arete. So living with arete, like I said, is this idea that we're going to live up to our full potential. We're going to be humans who focus on empathy and constant learning and development. We're going to be people who improve ourselves. Well done. You're doing that. The fact that you're attending this conference, you're dedicating time and potentially your own money in coming here and learning and getting better means you are living with arete. This is what we should be doing as professionals, definitely. But as human beings, like we should be striving to improve ourselves. It means embracing challenges as opportunities for growth. Remember this second concept of the difference between events and judgments. We can look at a challenging situation and we can shy away from it and be afraid, or we can look at a challenging situation and be excited about how that can help us grow and develop. But it also means that we should have respect for people around us. We should understand that they are trying to grow and get better as well, and the mistakes that they make are part of them growing and developing and trying to live with arete. Who would kind of class themselves as a leader? And I use the term leader very specifically, not manager. Who would kind of class themselves as a leader? Yeah, I that's, for those watching, that was probably about 25–50% of the audience. I would encourage those of you who didn't put up your hand to think about yourself as being a leader. I very deliberately used the word leader and not manager because anybody can be a leader. You don't need the job title. You don't need to be a tech lead or a lead engineer to be a leader. Being a leader is about this. It's about setting an example for others to follow. It's about being that person who people look up to and people want to kind of emulate and become better. Leadership doesn't always follow lines of management. This is really easy to see in our industry. We are very lucky in our industry. Do you know how you find out who are the leaders who are not managers in a software team? Break production. Don't do this. If you break production accidentally, and everybody rotates their chair to look at Jessica, Jessica's a leader in that team, whether or not she holds the title. These are the people who we look to help us. These are the people who are influential in our team culture. And you can be those people without getting the job title of manager or tech lead. And I do encourage you to take this mindset because really this is what this concept of living with arete is about. It's this continual self-improvement. So these three concepts are the core of Stoicism. And if you're going to take anything away from this talk, this is what I want you to take away. I want you to ask yourself, when you feel yourself being emotionally challenged by something, when you find yourself getting frustrated or angry or upset, ask yourself, what am I upset about? Is it something I can control or not? If the event is not something you can control, then how can you reshape your judgment about that event? How can you reframe that in order to change the emotional reaction you're having by having control and taking responsibility for your judgments? And then what are you doing that is living with arete? How are you improving yourself as a professional and as a human? What time are you dedicating to being better? Because these three core concepts, yes, are important to all humans, but are especially important to professionals and even more so important to leaders. Because this is how we get better, this is how we improve, this is how our teams get better, and this is how our teams improve. So I want to leave you with a quote from the man himself, which is, "Man conquers the world by conquering himself." And I apologize for the very gendered quote there. This was 2,500 years ago. This really should be humankind conquers themselves conquers the world by conquering themselves. That's the quote we would put today. But this idea that we cannot conquer the world without first looking inwards was something that I really struggled with. I spent a lot of my life railing against what was happening to me and kind of blaming everybody else for the situation I was in and finding excuses for why it was not my fault. The whole of my 20s was finding reasons why I wasn't the person that should have responsibility for what was going on. And it took a big shift in my mindset to change to this place where I can have a sense of control over everything. Has anybody heard of the term locus of control? Yeah? Got a couple of nods. So this is the concept that the language we use gives us a sense of how we view the universe. So say, for example, I was a tech leader, and I was working with my product manager. And I was trying to get them to do something. I was trying to change the way that they thought about it. And you were my boss, and I was complaining to you about this situation. I could complain about that in two different ways. I could complain about that by saying, oh, Jonathan just is not listening to me. No matter what I say, Jonathan has just got his ears closed and he's not listening. That's what we call an external locus of control. I'll explain the difference in a minute. Or I could say, no matter what happens, I cannot get Jonathan to listen to me. That's an internal locus of control. So if the words you use is it's the universe's fault, that's external. If the words you use, it's my fault, that's internal. Both of those extremes are unhealthy. Blaming the entire universe for everything that happens to you is unhealthy. Blaming yourself for everything that happens to you is unhealthy. What I would encourage you to do, most people have an external locus of control. Part of this talk is encouraging you to try and move that internal a little bit. I don't want you to leave this talk and think, I'm going to blame myself for everything that happens to me from now on, but I do want you to kind of ask yourself, how can I change this? What can I do? Is this in the dichotomy of control? Is this in the bucket of things that I have control over, or the bucket of things that I don't? And if it's in the bucket of things that I have control over, how can I do that? Awesome. All right, thank you very much for listening to this. If you want to know more about me, follow me on LinkedIn. I do a bunch of live streams regularly. I've had Scott Hanselman, Rand's charity majors on my live streams before talking about technology leadership topics. If you want to know more about what I do as a job, you can scan that second QR code. Thank you very much. We have some time for a little bit of Q&A if anybody wants to ask anything. People are busy scanning the QR code. Yes? So what to do if you have a very internal locus of control? This is actually my problem. I went from a place where I had a very external locus of control to swinging around to the other end of the spectrum and now having an extremely internal locus of control. Really, the solution there is to forgive yourself and to really assess those things and to try and take a more logical approach to things you can control. And to kind of, the dichotomy of control, it is this very binary idea. It is either in your control or out of your control. The reality of the world is that it's more nuanced than that. And most things are in your control ultimately, because you know what? You could take over the world and then everything is in your control. But the amount of effort and time and focus you'd have to go through in order to take over the entire world such that your best friend didn't borrow your car without you asking. It's kind of pointless. So the way that I think about it is how much effort do I have to put in such that this is in my control versus not in my control. And if I've got to put in 2, 3, 5 times as much effort to make it my problem as opposed to somebody else's, that's probably an indication to me that I'm over-indexing on internal locus of control. Yep.
So you started reading these books. How does your practice look like today?
Yeah, good question. So the question was, I started reading these books, what does my practice look like? So right in the beginning, let's go back to those books. So the Daily Stoic, I must admit I don't read it every day, but I definitely go to it when I want to kind of get a refresher and kind of re-encourage those thoughts in myself. For me, I've been doing this long enough now that it's kind of become part of the way I see the world. Like a lot of these skills and ways of seeing the world start off as very cognitive. So we've got to think through it logically, we have to process it, we have to go step by step. And then the more you do them, the more you practice them, the more they become instinctual. And so you don't have to think about them as cognitively anymore. And so a lot of the techniques from this have started becoming instinctual for me because I've been doing it for a few years at this point. So for me, I've internalized them to the point where I feel like I live them a lot more, but I still enjoy kind of reading and learning. Anybody else? Yep.
I'd like to add something to what you said before.
Sure.
Okay, so I started my own business 3 years ago. I have no education, so currently we're making a lot of money, which is great. I have failed probably more than anyone in this room because I have, again, zero education in anything that I do. I'm a UI designer, I'm a programmer, I'm also the CEO of a company. And I want to say the best thing that I've learned is when you fuck up, just embrace that moment as much as you can. It's a great opportunity to learn. I have turned around and I was very afraid of failing in the beginning. Now I'm actually very happy when I do because it's a great opportunity to learn. I teach that to my entire team. And with that being like the primary method of moving forward, everyone is in a very happy state. If you have a boss or a manager that literally gives you a hard time when you fail, then they're not a good manager. It's not your fault, it's their fault, basically.
Yeah. For those of you listening on the stream or watching on YouTube, the comment there was around being your own boss, having all of these skills and embracing failure as something to kind of help you grow and develop. I second that. This idea that we have to be perfect every single time. I think this is definitely a beer conversation later. If you want to talk about this, come talk to me about it. I have a lot of thoughts around the way that we hire, assess, and promote in our industry, which basically goes counter to what you're saying of we don't reward people who make mistakes and learn from them in our industry as much as we should. We should do that. Yep.
Kind of a meta question for a Q&A. I was just wondering if we could find a way to meet up during lunch for those who are interested for kind of a chit-chat about this.
A stoic lunch. I like the idea. Yeah, definitely. I'm doing. I've got a workshop this afternoon, so I'm doing a workshop on communication skills this afternoon. But before that, I'll just be hanging around in the lunch area. So by all means, please feel free to come up and have a chat, and maybe we can start a larger conversation. Yep. How are we doing for time? Yeah, we're good. We'll probably make this the last question. Yeah, so the question was, working in an environment where there's a lot of stuff that is not in your control, how do you deal with that situation? I'd encourage you to build a diagram like this for you. To go, what are the things that are not in my control? So if I'm working with legacy systems, then I'm probably working in an environment that there isn't a lot of test coverage, and so I'm afraid of making changes because I don't know the consequence of those changes, things like that. So I would make a list of this, and then for everything that isn't in your control, think about how you can kind of mitigate that through doing something else. There is always going to be things that are just not in your control, and there is just no way to mitigate it. The way to deal with that is to just accept it. That's the pure Stoicism answer, is to just go, yeah, this is not something I can control. Why am I getting stressed about this if it's not something I can control? That's the pure Stoicism answer. What I would say is, sure, if you can do that, that's awesome. But a lot of people really struggle with that, myself included. And so I always feel a lot better about it if I take this approach, where I'm going, okay, I cannot control that thing happening, but I can put enough things in place that my judgment and therefore emotional reaction to it is mitigated. Because although I cannot control that thing, I have structured my systems, my people, my processes such that the downside of it is mitigated as much as possible. And my job as a professional and as a leader, if anybody has ever done any training in risk management, the first thing they tell you when you do that training is you can never remove risk. You just cannot. The job of risk management is not to remove risk. It's to reduce risk as much as possible through a series of different things. And so the same is true of this. We cannot remove everything that is entirely, to be entirely out of our control. We've got to take ownership over how we mitigate some of those things. So that's what I would say. Pure Stoicism answer is, accept it. That's not satisfactory to me. I would say, what can you do to mitigate that? And then at least you can look yourself or your boss in the face and go, I've done as best as I possibly can. Cool. All right, thank you very much. Let's go have a Stoicism lunch.